Good day and welcome back to another episode of Give the People What They Want. I'm Zoe Alexandra, the editor of People's Dispatch, and as always, very honored to be joined by Roger McKenzie, the international editor of Morning Star, and Prasanth, an Indian journalist. Last week was a lot. We had a lot of stories. We have a lot this week as well, a little less rapidly developing, but of course, as always, we're going to get to Palestine, going to get to Madagascar, and all of the other developments that you need to be following this week.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
So, Prashant, last week we talked a lot about Palestine. We talked about the situation, the Global Smooth Flotilla. It feels like that was ages ago, because just the following day, momentous news was announced. Positive news met with some skepticism, which was that a ceasefire deal was agreed upon, really brokered by Donald Trump in a lot of ways. And of course, since then, there have been kind of rapid developments in that regard. So take us through what's the latest. Has this ceasefire deal stuck? What does it mean for the region?
Right, there are like so many elements to this. It's, we can talk about it for quite some time. But the most important thing, of course, is that a ceasefire is in place, and that means an end to the extreme brutality of the Israelis for now. Now, it's important to note that even then there have been violations. There have been instances of Israeli forces shooting and killing Palestinians, claiming that they came close to their lines, etc., etc. So there has been, even now, there have been reports of Palestinian deaths in Gaza despite a ceasefire. And there have been now efforts to also start recovering bodies from under the rubble. The death toll, the official death toll, the most conservative estimates are around the range of 67 to 68,000. But those authorities in Gaza, medical experts, all of them have pointed out that we could be looking at a much higher death toll, primarily because the fact that so many bodies are buried under the rubble. There's been no opportunity for rescue workers, for instance, to try to retrieve those bodies. So that process is slowly going on. So we'll definitely see the overall death toll increasing in the coming days. There has been some delivery of aid. Now, again, it's important to note that once again, Israel is clearly testing the limits of the ceasefire right now, because they're saying that according to the original plan, Hamas was supposed to release the captives it had and the bodies of some of the captives, but it is always very clear that the bodies would take much longer to be returned because of the brutal Israeli bombing. But now Israel is citing that as a reason to reduce the number of food trucks and relief trucks that are coming into Gaza at this point. The estimate is that they need at least 600 trucks per day. We're looking at maybe around 200 to 250 trucks that are coming in at this point. Even that is maybe an optimistic number. And it's important to note that the amount of relief needed, the kind of relief needed, is so multifaceted in terms of, we're talking about food, we're talking about construction equipment, we're talking about medical equipment, every aspect of life that can be imagined. One of the, shocking bits of news, and you end up feeling shocked, is the fact that after the ceasefire was announced, after the ceasefire was approved by the Israeli cabinet, as Israeli soldiers were withdrawing, they torched the sewage treatment, one of the most important sewage treatment plants in Gaza. So what you're seeing is that facilities like the sewage treatment plant, facilities like hospitals, we heard of multiple reports of hospital after hospital being bombed. Reconstructing all of this is going to take a long time and a lot of aid and material. So that's definitely very important to watch, and that this is definitely a pressure point as far as Israelis are concerned. They're going to be constantly pushing in trying to reduce the supplies and see how much they can continue to starve the people of Gaza in every sense possible. And I think this is a connected point, which is that this also highlights the relevance of the fact that this struggle is not over. This does not mean the ceasefire does not mean that ceasefire does not mean peace. It does not mean an end to the occupation. It does not mean an end to the apartheid. This ceasefire does not mean also that the protests can stop in even the slightest manner, because it is all the more essential that all of us continue to watch Israel right now very carefully, because they're going to be doing everything possible to sabotage the ceasefire, and until they can completely sabotage it, to test its limits, to keep as much as possible exerting all kinds of pressure on the people of Gaza. And we know that most of the other countries involved in this process are not going to intervene on this, are probably going to justify Israel. It's interesting to note that when Donald Trump came to Egypt and gave his very rambling address, he said two important things. One is that, the world, he said something on the lines of the world is applying a lot of pressure and the world won out. Now, I don't know if he was trying to be funny or whatever, but the fact is, it is true. The fact that, it is the intense pressure applied across the world by millions of people taking to the streets week after week, month after month, that has, led in some ways to this ceasefire, and has not allowed Israel to kind of keep claiming or keep enjoying the impunity it had. And the other point, equally important to note, is that he said that now the world will go back to loving Israel again, which again is the heights of delusion, but also important to note that this is perhaps what a section of the leadership in the West thinks, that even if they don't believe that people will do that, they think that they can go back to think, okay, right now the ceasefire is signed, hopefully the pressure comes down and we can go back to dealing with Israel as normal. And that, I think, is what there is a constant need for vigilance and a constant need for pressure to prevent, because the apartheid is definitely not over, the colonialism is definitely not over, the violence is definitely not at all over.
And noteworthy, there was a national strike in Spain, I believe today, in solidarity with Palestine. So of course that pressure on the streets is not giving up. And, important to watch out for who was actually at that meeting in Egypt and how were they treating Trump? How will they kind of deal with the region in the future? I think there's a lot of governments in the Gulf that would be happy with, the U.S. reestablishing a sort of status quo situation. What will happen with the Abraham Accords? These are all things to watch out for. Well, protests have led to governments being changed. And the situation in Madagascar, I think a lot of people don't really know what's happening in Madagascar, haven't ever really followed the politics. Now they're paying attention, but perhaps don't really understand what's happening. Roger, take us through it, give a little context, help us understand from a more popular perspective.
I'm not sure that any of us really understand the politics that's emerging from this yet. What we know is there's been a seismic change that's taken place in Madagascar. So I think we reported last week about the protests that were taking place. By the weekend, by Saturday, and I should say as well, these protests were all about people being denied access to water and electricity and so on. And these protests were primarily led by young people, which actually in Madagascar isn't a surprise, because the median age in Madagascar is 20. That's an amazing figure to be a median age. But by Saturday, these demonstrations were continuing. And then the military decided that instead of turning their guns or turning their force on the protesters, they were going to join the protesters. And that's what happened on Saturday. And that moved things on rather quickly after that, because it became really clear within hours that the military had taken control over the armory of the country, and that they were really serious about the need for change. And it was a few hours later, I think sort of during Sunday, that France decided to intervene in a way by flying in and removing the president out of Madagascar and flying him off to a location that still hasn't been revealed where the president is, despite the fact that the president has given sort of YouTube-y, sort of social media speeches, even yesterday, trying to dissolve the parliament, which actually only ended up speeding things up, because he dissolved the parliament, and within hours of that, then it was announced that that the military were now in control. It's been announced today that the president, the new president, will be Colonel Michael. Need to get his name right. Randrianarina. So a name there that hopefully everybody will pronounce better than me, but important because his name is going to be to the forefront of what happens at Madagascar for a little while longer. So we don't know the political nature of what's happened yet, but what we've seen over the last 24 hours is that we've seen, again, we've seen massive celebrations on the streets by young people supporting the military takeover. So are we going to see a similar sort of thing to what happens in Burkina Faso? I don't know, because we don't know the nature of the politics yet. What we know so far is that there has been this change, that it's more likely that people won't be denied access to water and electricity and so on. What we also know is that the military have said that they're going to stay in control until elections can be called in a year and a half, 2 years or something. So massive changes, but it seems to have popular support. But I think it's really important that we don't jump the gun and kind of name it as being something that it isn't. So we'll no doubt hear over the next few days and weeks and months the nature of the politics of this change that's taking place. But what we know is that there's been massive change. The puppet figure of France, the previous president, he's gone, and that there's a new regime in charge in Madagascar.
Yeah, I think that's definitely good to keep that perspective. We've seen in the past year even how some of these kind of popular uprisings can be quickly interpreted to serve kind of people's own political analysis. So it's important to keep a sober head. Moving right along to a region closer to where I am, which is the Caribbean. This has also been kind of dominating at least some headlines, probably not getting as much attention as it should, given the unprecedented nature of what's happening right now. Yesterday, Donald Trump announced yet another U.S. airstrike in the Caribbean. And I'll say that again, a U.S. military strike in the Caribbean on a boat, killing 6 people, and increasing the death toll to about 27, if I'm not mistaken, people that have been killed in the last month by the United States carrying out airstrikes in the Caribbean against what it claims are drug traffickers. Every single element of that is essentially illegal because, first of all, they're not verifying who are the people in these boats. There's no trial. These are completely extrajudicial assassinations taking place against what seems to be oftentimes fishermen. Both Venezuela and Colombia have confirmed that in these airstrikes, civilians from their countries have been killed who are, just fishermen. So we're already seeing that this way of just carrying out strikes against boats that you think could be drug traffickers is of course going to lead to this outcome of killing people indiscriminately and using a narrative that they're somehow engaged in the drug trade to kind of cover it up. And if that weren't enough, of course, these airstrikes are not in a vacuum. It's coming at a time where the United States is increasing exponentially the pressure against Venezuela. Last week, Donald Trump announced that it was that he ordered essentially his special envoy, Richard Grenell, to cut all diplomatic dialogue with Venezuela. So they had been engaged in this process. There had been, for example, kind of a prisoner swap in exchange for easing of certain measures that the U.S. was taking against Venezuela. We've had, episode after episode, the 250 Venezuelans who were kidnapped by the United States and sent to El Salvador. There's been a lot of kind of maneuvers between the United States, between Venezuela, El Salvador getting in the mix in order to kind of ease tensions amid kind of these rapid intensifications. And now the fact that as the U.S. is carrying out this kind of, again, really unprecedented move of carrying out airstrikes in the Caribbean and now has suspended dialogue, this is not a good sign. And at the same time, just for extra context, the U.S. has designated, of course, had already designated Tren de Aragua, a foreign terrorist organization, an enemy combatant that was run by the Venezuelan government. Of course, other documents that were leaked to liberal outlets like the New York Times revealed that the U.S. government knows that actually this gang that really doesn't have even that much influence and impact in the drug trade is in no way connected to the Venezuelan government. So this smoke screen, if it weren't so dangerous, it would be laughable, because it's very clear that it is just that. It is a smoke screen. It's contradicting the U.S.'s own documents, its own internal documents, its own public reports about drug trafficking in the region. But there is this very serious escalation. The U.S. is a rogue power. It assassinated Iranian General Qasem Soleimani when he was in Iraq, as we remember, just some years back. What's to stop it from carrying out a similar kind of strike against the Venezuelan leadership? The Venezuelan people have been mobilizing. They have been enlisting, for example, in the militia in record numbers. But what we've seen over the past 2 years is enough to know that the United States knows that it has a military might. It knows that the world essentially has not done much to stop horrendous atrocities. So what's it to stop the U.S. from carrying out an attack like this? So all eyes on Venezuela right now. It's a very concerning situation. Of course, hoping that this diplomatic route gets retaken, gets opened up again. Nobody wants airstrikes in the Caribbean. The people of the Caribbean do not want this. I'm sure, Roger, Jamaica does not want this. None of the nations want this. The Caribbean has been declared a zone of peace by the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. This is something that the people of the region uphold, and having U.S. warships and having airstrikes is definitely against that. So we'll be following that as well. Of course, we've had very kind of meticulous coverage on it on People's Dispatch just because of the gravity of this. So make sure to follow it, because a war in the Caribbean is not something we need right now. And speaking of kind of intensified conflicts, we'll hop right back to the African continent. Prasanth, what's happening with the DRC? There's been increased attention, some attention away. Where are we at right now?
Right, there have been a host of developments actually taking place. I think on the ground, activists are calling attention to the fact that the violence in the eastern part of the country continues, where the M23 group have taken over certain provinces, especially the North Kivu and South Kivu provinces. There's been a lot of area controlled by them. The attacks continue. I think there was a UN study which said that, or a report which said that from June to September or so, I think over 1,000 people have died, although it's definitely likely to be an undercount, because people on the ground, for instance, have been saying that the abductions, the attacks have been almost a daily affair in those regions. So that's happening on the one hand. But equally on the other hand, I think some of the latest reports have been, I think, instructive in a way, because on the one hand, we see that yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, the DRC and the M23 rebel group, they signed an agreement to establish an authority to monitor the ceasefire. Now, the ceasefire is supposed to take effect, or it's based on an agreement which was signed in July between the government and the rebel group, based on which a peace was supposed to be established by set in place or put in place by August. It wasn't achieved, right? And the reason it wasn't achieved is because that the discussions that took place really are on very, very thin grounding, because there are some of the most fundamental questions on the operations itself have not been resolved, in terms of who's going to control that territory, what's going to happen to the prisoners, what is the future of the administration of the region. The larger political questions, none of them resolved. Not only not resolved, but not addressed even. And again, there's this other side. On the other side, the DRC and the Rwanda are also taking part in some kind of discussions. In June, they had an agreement. That agreement has been coming up time and again, but really nothing much has moved forward on it, except some minor diplomatic and procedural stuff. The aspect that has moved forward is the commercial element, and I think that takes us to the heart of the matter, which is that thousands of people have been killed in the DRC since in the last 12 months or so, because assault really escalated in November last year. And I think the refugee count is around 1.7, close to 2 million people at this point of time. But the international attention on the DRC has primarily been in terms of its minerals, and that has really guided the peace process, or so-called peace process, in that region. So the discussions between the DRC and Rwanda, the discussions between the DRC and M23, all of them are being held in the background of the commercial interests of the United States and Qatar, which are emerging as the two major players in this discussion, in this peace process at this point. And that makes it very clear that the agenda here is really not peace at all. It is primarily to find a way to sort of establish a mechanism whereby the minerals of DRC and Rwanda has way lesser minerals, and it has a system already, but the much larger mineral wealth of the DRC can flow to the United States, can flow to the Western countries. And that really is the aim of this entire so-called peace process. It's not real peace, it's not justice, it's not trying to reduce the suffering of the people, it's not trying to, and we're talking about decades of suffering, decades of injustice that have not been addressed. So none of that is really in the picture right now. It seems to basically be, how can we put all of these people together so that the minerals start flowing, and we can establish that kind of a flow properly, right? So that's really what's happening right now. So a very unfortunate situation, also because when we read these reports, it does look like there are some positives. When you read a report like, okay, a ceasefire monitoring mechanism is been put in place. Okay, there have been 2 rounds of discussions. That's great. But actually, two key questions. One, it's not really reflecting on the ground. 2, the fact that the very foundations of these discussions are probably untenable in the larger sense of the term, or when it comes to peace and justice. Really, I think we ought to be careful about that, and also, like I said, keep bringing this up, because the Congo is one of the great tragedies, of course, but really human-made tragedies of the 21st century, the way the people have suffered and struggled, but continue to fight for their dignity and have received international solidarity.
Well, I think one of the themes of today's discussion, Prasanth, really is how to achieve not peace in name, but peace with social justice, and peace that can be lasting. Because how can you have lasting peace when it's predicated upon the continued extraction of your resource by the West? Speaking of the West, a major player in neocolonialism in the African continent, but of course, as we said last week, going through an acute crisis of its own, which had a surprise this week. Roger, I'll let you get to the punchline. It's almost too crazy to be real.
Well, I mean, if you didn't think it was crazy enough that a former president is found guilty of money laundering, basically, and taking money off Libya to fund his election campaign, he's been told that he can make an appointment, basically, to turn up next week to be for a 5-year jail sentence, which frankly I think is very civilized, which I've never known happen to any black person who can be told, just turn up and we'll jail you if you don't mind. But on top of all of that, just absolute political chaos taking place. So last week we reported that the Prime Minister had resigned. Brilliantly, by the way, kind of praised by Prasanth last week, where so he said he'd resigned. By the end of the week, he was back as Prime Minister again, and by the end of the weekend, he put together a new cabinet, which wasn't really new. It was pretty much the same people he'd got there before, and then the horse trading started, because by Tuesday, by law, the Prime Minister had to had to present a budget to the National Assembly to give them the legal amount of time to be able to consider that and vote on it before the end of the year. Now, before he even got up and spoke, the France Unbowed, so the left-wing group within the largest left-wing party within the National Assembly, had already said we're putting down a vote of no confidence. And then the far-right National Rally said, well, we're going to put down a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister as well. All it actually needed on top of that for the Prime Minister's position to be completely untenable was for the Socialist Party and for the Green Party to also join that. Well, neither of them have yet, because when the Prime Minister got up yesterday, one of the things that he said was he ditched the absolute golden prize that President Macron wanted in the first place, which was pension. It's reported in the mainstream media as pension reform. It's not. It's pension gutting, basically, and it's raising the pension age to an amount that the French people simply won't buy. I actually covered a demonstration a couple of years ago in Paris when literally hundreds of thousands of people turned up to march through Paris in opposition to those pension changes. So that was obviously put forward as a means of being able to try and buy off the Socialist Party, because the Socialist Party in particular had said that this was their golden egg, really. Unless, if this happened, then there was a chance that they would support the Prime Minister staying in power. When the Prime Minister gave his speech, not only did he give an indication that they were suspending these pension reforms in inverted commas, but what he also said was still that there was going to be a massive gutting of public sector spending. But what he also indicated was the possibility of a wealth tax against the rich. Now, this was something that the Socialist Party had also put up as being something that they were interested in. And frankly, we're all interested, I think, in the idea of a wealth tax against the super rich. But it seems as though there's going to be something, the mood music appears to be moving in that direction, that there's going to be some kind of wealth tax, that the pensions reform is going to be on hold until the next presidential election, so 2 years' time. So it looks for all to see at the moment, and France is so weird at the moment politically that anything could have happened by the end of this sentence, frankly, is that what could happen is that the present government may well survive. If it survives, it's still only going to be temporary, because I cannot see this getting through to another 2 years. I just cannot see it. So, because even if it gets through this budget round, it's still got to do it again next year. I think tomorrow, so Thursday, is the big day, really, because the votes of no confidence take place on Thursday. So we'll see then whether the Socialist Party is going to throw in its lot with the business class and vote to maintain this government that's been put together by Macron. His last chance, basically, before he really has to call a general election again, or he has to step down. And the Communist Party is calling on him to step down. It's calling on the Prime Minister to step down. It's saying the only way forward, if you won't appoint a Prime Minister from the largest grouping in Parliament, which is the left grouping, which includes Communist Party, which Socialist Party is still kind of in, but also French Unbowed as well, or France Unbowed as well, then unless you appoint somebody from that bloc, then we're going to keep putting a vote of no confidence, because you're ignoring the electorate. So Thursday is going to be a critical day. We'll see what happens then, and we'll no doubt come back to this absolute bloody chaos that's taking place in France at the moment when we come on again next week.
I mean, absolute chaos in France. It's almost looking at Macron's trajectory and remembering just everything that he is, faced, not in a tragic way, but what he's kind of like tried to weather. It seems crazy to think that he'd survive another 2 years. Not only overseeing kind of this historic uprising across the Sahel against French colonialism and French imperialism, but of course, crisis at home constantly. But it is, I think, noteworthy, and I'm really glad you brought this up, Roger, that the fact that they're kind of willing to cede on these issues means they're definitely on the back foot. So I think that's the people are in a strong position to kind of keep pushing. And it's also been, the heart of so much Palestine mobilization, such a huge community that's been showing up kind of on a weekly basis almost. So we'll definitely keep following it. And, it's a tragedy of comedy. I don't even know how to describe it, but it's the impressive mobilization of the French people definitely is inspiring. And, we're hopefully there will be good continued news there, and maybe the left will be able to kind of impose their rightfully won victory on the formation of a different government. I think that brings us to the end of our program for today. Of course, with a lot to get through, lots happening this week, lots of things to continue following. A lot of these are news items that are in development, especially the situation in Venezuela, the ceasefire deal. All of these things require constant attention, and we'll be back with you next week to kind of continue that dialogue, to continue see where things are at. And as always, between now and then, you can follow us on People's Dispatch on all social media platforms and our website, peoplesdispatch.org. Also follow Morningstar, the latest from the class struggle across the UK, which hope is not lost. I think we're hope is not lost in Europe. We're gonna continue to root for it, even if it's a difficult moment. So tune in, share the episode with a friend. As always, you can listen on YouTube or as a podcast. So very accessible, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, Prasanth and Roger, for another great discussion.